Let me tell you something that almost nobody in mainstream media is willing to say out loud. On June 13th, 2026, the President of the United States went on social media and announced that a formal peace agreement with Iran would be signed the very next day. He said the Strait of Hormuz would reopen immediately for all ships. He said this deal would permanently prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And within hours, every major news network on the planet, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, was running wall-to-wall coverage asking the same breathless question: is this finally peace? Is the war really ending? That is the wrong question. And I want to spend the next few minutes explaining to you why that question is so dangerously, fundamentally wrong. Because while every camera in the world is pointed at some imaginary handshake between Washington and Tehran, something else is happening on the ground right now that almost nobody is talking about. And until you understand that thing, you cannot understand anything else that is unfolding in this region. Israel is bombing southern Lebanon as we speak. Not last week, not as a footnote from 2 months ago, right now, in the same 48-hour window that American and Iranian diplomats are telling the world that peace is within reach, the Israeli Air Force has carried out heavy strikes across more than 20 villages in southern Lebanon, including the city of Nabatish. Mass evacuation orders went out on June 12th and 13th. Hezbollah fired rockets and drones back into northern Israel. People on both sides are dying. And the mainstream media is covering this as background noise. Oh, that old Israel-Hezbollah thing. Yeah, they've been at it for years. Move on. No, stop right there. This is not background noise. This is the central contradiction that makes every single claim about a peace deal collapse before it even gets off the ground. And today I want to walk you through 3 things that nobody is connecting together, but that absolutely must be connected if you want to understand what is actually happening in this part of the world. The first thing is the role of Israel in all of this. Not Israel as an ally or an enemy, but Israel as a strategic actor that is neither at the negotiating table nor bound by anything that gets agreed there. And why that makes any deal structurally impossible to sustain. The second thing is what the actual document being negotiated, a 14-point framework between the United States and Iran, actually is, because it is not a peace deal. When you look at what Iran's own newspapers and officials are saying about it, you start to realize it functions much more like what strategists call a tactical pause. A deliberate, calculated decision to buy time, recover resources, and prepare for the next phase of a conflict that was never really intended to end. And the third thing, and this is the one that matters most for the long run, the one with consequences that go far beyond whatever happens in Tehran or Washington next week, is what is really happening to the Strait of Hormuz and why the pre-war status of that waterway may be gone permanently, not temporarily disrupted, gone. And the implications of that are so large, so foundational to how the global economy actually functions, that most people simply are not equipped to process them. But I'm going to try to walk you through it anyway. Let's start with Israel. And I want to be precise here because the details matter. Benjamin Netanyahu has made his position unmistakable in recent days. Through direct communication with the White House and through public statements from his defense minister, the message from Jerusalem is this: Israel is not a party to whatever the United States and Iran agree on. Israel retains what it calls full freedom of operational action across all arenas, including Lebanon, to protect its own interest. That is not an interpretation. That is the stated official position. Now think about what that means for a moment. The United States is trying to broker a ceasefire in a broader diplomatic framework with Iran, and one of America's closest strategic partners. The country whose conflict with Iran's network of proxy forces was one of the central triggers for this whole crisis, is publicly announcing that it considers itself completely unbound by the outcome of those negotiations. It will continue military operations whenever and wherever it judges necessary. Full stop. Here's where it gets interesting. One of Iran's non-negotiable conditions in the 14-point framework is a comprehensive ceasefire across all active fronts, including Lebanon. Iran's foreign minister made this explicit on Iranian state television on June 12th. Iran is demanding not just a pause in fighting, but a permanent end to Israeli strikes in Lebanon and an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory. He used language about never abandoning those who stood with Iran through this conflict, meaning Hezbollah, meaning the Shiite political and military network that Israel is currently bombing. So you have two positions that cannot occupy the same reality. Iran says the deal must include Lebanon and must constrain Israel. Israel says it will not be constrained by the deal and will continue operating in Lebanon. And the United States, somehow, is trying to hold both of these simultaneously. Reports suggest Trump has been personally asking Netanyahu to show restraint in Lebanon while negotiations proceed. Netanyahu has been ignoring those requests and continuing the strikes anyway. Think about the game theory here. In any negotiation, the most dangerous actors are not the ones sitting at the table. They are the ones with the power to destroy the table from the outside. Israel is not at the table, but Israel has enough leverage, military, political, historical, to blow up any agreement the moment it becomes strategically inconvenient. And right now, Israel is exercising that leverage every single day. Every strike in Lebanon is a message. Every Hezbollah rocket fired back is a response. And every one of those exchanges is making the gap between what Iran demands and what can actually be delivered on the ground wider and wider. Now, I want to offer you a perspective here that goes beyond the immediate crisis, because what Israel is doing is not simply reacting to security threats in real time. Some analysts suggest it fits into a much longer strategic logic. The idea broadly is that Israel's regional interests are not well served by a stable, economically recovering Iran. A weakened Iran, a fragmented Iran. An Iran that is still fighting a proxy war through Hezbollah while simultaneously dealing with internal political fractures and economic deterioration. That Iran is strategically manageable in ways that a stable, sanctions-free Iran is not. From that perspective, an American diplomatic breakthrough that removes pressure from Tehran and allows Iran to rebuild is not something Israel would welcome. And one possible explanation for why Israel appears willing to absorb friction with Washington over Lebanon is that the strategic cost of a stable Iran deal is, from Jerusalem's point of view, higher than the cost of a strained relationship with the White House. Now, set Israel aside for a moment. Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that Netanyahu somehow agrees to stand down in Lebanon. He picks up the phone, calls off the strikes, and gives the negotiations room to breathe. Would the deal then work? Would it hold? The answer appears to be still no. And the reason for that brings us to the second major piece of this puzzle: what Iran's own voices are actually saying about this negotiation. I want to introduce a concept I think is essential for understanding what is unfolding here: the idea of a tactical pause. A tactical pause is not a peace agreement. It is a deliberate strategic decision by one or both parties to stop active hostilities temporarily, not because their objectives have changed, not because they have given up on what they were fighting for, but because they need time. Time to recover economically, time to rebuild military capacity, time to wait for a more favorable geopolitical moment, and then, when conditions improve, to resume from a stronger position. Now, I'm not making this characterization based on Western intelligence assessments or American government talking points. I am drawing on what Iran's own media ecosystem is saying. One prominent Iranian newspaper described the core function of this agreement not as a resolution of the underlying conflict, but as a breathing space, a chance to rebuild both offensive and defensive capacity in preparation for, in their words, a full-scale confrontation. Another Iranian publication, one considered very close to the hardline faction of the political establishment, ran a front-page piece with a headline that translates roughly to, "The strait was closed by force and it will not be opened by diplomacy." And perhaps most significantly, before his death, Iran's former supreme leader reportedly told his own internal constituency that the negotiations with America were, in his framing, simply a delay, a pause before the establishment of what he described as the Islamic Shiite state. Now, some analysts will rightly point out that hardline statements from ideologically extreme publications don't necessarily reflect the position of the diplomatic team actually conducting negotiations. There is a genuine internal split inside Iran between the faction oriented toward diplomatic engagement, the foreign ministry professionals trying to get a workable deal, and the hardline IRGC faction that views any compromise as a form of capitulation. That split is real, and the diplomatic faction is not nothing. But here's what that nuance cannot erase. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not simply a military institution. Over decades, it has constructed a parallel economic empire inside Iran: construction conglomerates, logistics networks, import monopolies, shadow financial systems that operate largely outside the formal state budget. When Iran's official economy collapses under sanctions and blockade pressure, ordinary Iranian citizens bear the weight of that collapse. IRGC institutional leadership does not feel that pressure in the same way. Their survival is not contingent on economic normalization in the way that the average Iranian family's survival is. They have resources and they have weapons. And in a political system where hard power ultimately determines who gets the final say, the people with the weapons tend to get the final say. And the IRGC has been showing you exactly what it thinks of this negotiation. Its affiliated media outlets have been actively leaking the contents of the draft framework to the public in ways specifically designed to lock Iran's diplomatic team into maximalist positions they never intended to make public. Protesters with apparent IRGC-linked sympathies have appeared outside Iranian foreign ministry offices, chanting against the foreign minister and calling him a compromiser and a traitor. The head of Iran's judiciary, not a diplomat, not a general, but the person who controls who gets arrested in Iran, has publicly stated that Iran's confrontation with America will have no end until what he calls the uprooting of oppression. When the man who controls the prison system says the war is not over, and the military force that controls the country's hard power is actively sabotaging the diplomatic team, a signed document in some capital city does not change the strategic reality on the ground. And then there are the actions. Iran has been collapsing tunnels and placing explosive mines around the entrances to its underground nuclear facilities while negotiations were actively ongoing. Multiple intelligence sources reported this independently. We are talking about a significant stockpile of uranium enriched to a level that, depending on how it is processed, could potentially yield multiple weapons. And that material is now physically buried under collapsed rock and surrounded by landmines. Think about what that action tells you. When your diplomats are discussing handing over nuclear material as part of a peace process, your military is simultaneously making that material physically impossible for any outside party to access. Those two things cannot coexist in a genuine peace framework. That is not the behavior of a country preparing to disarm. That is the behavior of a country preparing to hold what it has. Which brings us to the 6 core deadlocks in the actual draft agreement. And I want to walk through these because they illustrate just how far apart these two sides actually are beneath the surface of the announcement. The first deadlock is the Strait of Hormuz itself. The American position is that the strait must reopen immediately and unconditionally for all international shipping. Iran's position, stated clearly by its own foreign minister, is that Iran retains the right to manage the strait and collect service fees from passing vessels. Those two positions are not negotiating stances that can be split down the middle. They are fundamentally incompatible descriptions of who controls one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet. The second deadlock is the nuclear material. Washington wants Iran's enriched uranium dismantled and physically removed from Iranian territory. Iran is only willing to discuss dilution of that material inside Iran, under its own supervision. And as I just described, the military is simultaneously making the question of physical removal moot by burying the material underground. The third deadlock is sequencing. Iran wants the naval blockade lifted and frozen assets released before it takes any concrete steps toward nuclear compliance. America's position is that economic benefits come after demonstrated compliance, not before. Both positions are completely rational from each side's perspective, which is precisely why they are irresolvable without one side making a concession that would be interpreted domestically as a catastrophic capitulation. The fourth deadlock is the question of reparations for damage caused by the strikes on Iran. Iran's draft included a compensation mechanism. The United States has listed rejection of any such mechanism as a non-negotiable precondition. The political toxicity of the phrase war reparations in Washington is essentially absolute. The fifth deadlock is Iran's proxy network, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the broader axis of resistance. America demands Iran sever those relationships. Iran says it will not abandon Hezbollah under any circumstances. And while they are arguing about this on paper, Israel is bombing Hezbollah on the ground, which makes the entire theoretical conversation about Iran potentially withdrawing support almost secondary to the kinetic reality unfolding in real time. And the sixth deadlock, which is perhaps the most underreported, is the internal political fragmentation on both sides. On the Iranian side, the diplomatic team is genuinely trying to negotiate, while the IRGC and its allies are actively working to prevent the deal from being struck on anything other than maximalist terms. On the American side, opposition to any deal comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Democrats calling it a structural surrender, hawkish Republicans calling for military escalation rather than diplomatic engagement. A negotiating team operating in that environment does not have the political cover it needs to make the kinds of compromises that a real agreement would require. Add all of this together: the Israel problem, the six deadlocks, the internal fragmentations, the physical fortification of nuclear sites, and what you are looking at is not a peace deal. It is a pause. A moment in which both sides catch enough breath to sell their domestic audiences a narrative of progress while preparing, each in their own way, for what comes next. And now I want to talk about what comes next for the Strait of Hormuz, because this is the piece that almost no one is connecting to the broader picture. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the narrowest and most consequential bodies of water on Earth. Roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through it. Japan depends on that route for 3/4 of its energy imports. China runs 40% of its oil through there. India, 60%. The Japanese government itself has publicly stated that a sustained strait closure would exhaust the country's oil reserves within months and cause the Japanese economy to seize up. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are the actual stakes. Now, here's what Iran is actually saying about the strait. Its foreign minister has publicly stated that Iran's capacity to act in the strait remains permanently available as a strategic instrument. Iranian media has confirmed that the draft framework contains no commitment from Tehran to surrender management rights over those waters. An Iranian lawmaker publicly compared Iran's proposed role in managing the strait to the oil nationalization of 1951, when Iran kicked the British out of its petroleum industry and claimed sovereign control over its own resources. That comparison was not accidental, it was deliberate signaling. Iran is telling you that it views its position in the strait the same way it views ownership of its oil, as a fundamental sovereign right, not a negotiating chip. And the Iranian parliament is reportedly drafting legislation that would formally codify this position in domestic law, giving Iran the legal right to collect fees from ships passing through the strait and to regulate traffic through that waterway. Now think about what that means for the architecture of global finance. The American dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is not based on gold. The gold standard ended in 1971. The dollar functions as the world's currency for one specific structural reason. The major Gulf oil producers sell their oil in dollars, receive dollars, and recycle those dollars back into American treasury bonds and financial markets. That circular flow is the invisible foundation of American fiscal power. It is what allows the United States to carry tens of trillions in national debt and still function as the anchor of the global financial system. Now insert a permanent Iranian presence in the Strait of Hormuz into that equation. What happens when Gulf oil, the oil that the entire petrodollar system is built on, now comes with a permanent Iranian surcharge attached? What happens to the dollar's reserve status when the flow of energy that system depends on becomes subject to Iranian gatekeeping, Iranian fees, Iranian management? I am not suggesting the dollar collapses overnight. That is not how these systems fail. They corrode slowly, unevenly, in ways that are easy to dismiss at any given moment, and very hard to reverse once the drift reaches a critical threshold. And the Gulf states themselves are more fragile than most people appreciate. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, these are wealthy nations that import the overwhelming majority of their food and depend on desalination for the bulk of their fresh water. A single Iranian drone, costing perhaps $50,000 to produce, is capable of destroying a desalination plant that serves millions of people. The cost of intercepting that drone using American missile defense systems runs into the millions per attempt, and interception is not guaranteed. That asymmetry in cost and capacity, played out over months and years, creates a structural problem that no amount of military spending fully resolves. What happens if Iran never fully closes the strait but simply makes it permanently unpredictable? Ships passing through face intermittent risk rather than absolute blockade. Insurance rates skyrocket. Shipping companies begin routing around the Gulf. Investment in Gulf energy infrastructure starts to dry up because the risk premium has permanently changed. The petrodollar system does not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It slowly becomes less reliable, less central, less inevitable, and when that happens, when the energy trade that the dollar is built on starts flowing through new channels under new terms, the financial architecture that the United States has depended on since the mid-20th century begins to look very different. Here is what I want you to watch in the days and weeks ahead. If a memorandum of understanding is signed, pay close attention to how each side describes it to their own domestic audience. American officials will almost certainly claim Hormuz is reopening unconditionally and Iran's nuclear program is being rolled back. Iranian officials will almost certainly describe it as retaining management rights over the strait and keeping the nuclear material in Iranian hands while receiving economic relief. When you see two completely incompatible descriptions of the same document being offered simultaneously by the two parties who supposedly just agreed on something, that is your confirmation that what was signed is a tactical pause, not a resolution. Watch what happens in Lebanon within 48 hours of any signing. If Israeli military operations continue and Hezbollah continues to respond, and Iran says nothing about withdrawing its support for those operations, the deal's central premise will have been contradicted on the ground before the ink is dry. And watch the Iranian parliament. If that legislation formalizing Iran's management rights over the strait passes into Iranian law, even after a framework agreement is nominally signed, the pre-war legal status of the strait is gone. Permanently, not as a negotiating stance, as a statute. Statutes are much harder to reverse than diplomatic positions. If that legislation passes, the debate about whether to return the strait to its previous status becomes a debate about forcing Iran to repeal its own domestic law. That is a fundamentally different kind of confrontation than anything we have seen so far. Look, I want to be honest about something. There is a genuine argument to be made that even an imperfect, ambiguous agreement has real value. Both sides are genuinely exhausted. Iran's civilian population is suffering severely. Trump needs something he can credibly call a diplomatic achievement. The global economy is bleeding from the uncertainty around Gulf energy. And there is a real school of thought. Serious analysts make this case that once you have formally declared something to be over, the political cost of reigniting it increases significantly. There is a ratchet effect to peace declarations, even fragile ones. That argument has merit. I'm not dismissing it, but what it cannot account for is this. The institutions inside Iran that have the most to gain from continued conflict and the organizational capacity to perpetuate it are precisely the institutions that are most insulated from the economic pain that is supposedly driving Iran toward a deal. The population suffers, the institutional military and security apparatus does not suffer in the same way. And that asymmetry means the pressure to make peace and the capacity to make war are not distributed evenly across Iranian society. The people who are exhausted are not the people in control. And the people in control are, by their own actions and their own words, telling you they are not finished. Always trust actions over words. Iran's uranium is buried underground, surrounded by mines. That is an action. That is Iran telling you through what it does rather than what it says, where it expects this to go. And when you hold that action alongside the rhetoric from the judicial establishment, the sabotage by IRGC-affiliated media, the bombs falling on Lebanon right now, the proposed legislation to codify management rights over the world's most important oil waterway, the picture that emerges is not of a country ending a war. It is of a country that believes it is in the middle of a long conflict that has entered a temporary quieter phase, and that is using this quieter phase to position itself as advantageously as possible for what comes next. The real question is not whether a document gets signed. The real question is which side is using this pause more effectively. Which side is rebuilding, repositioning, and preparing more systematically for the next phase of a confrontation that neither side has actually decided to end. And how many more announcements of imminent peace deals will the world absorb before it finally reckons honestly with what this conflict actually is and how far it still has to run?